500 feet above the Pakistani countryside. 600 miles per hour. The engine dies. No bang. No warning. Just silence. Where the WP-7 turbojets' roar had been a moment before, there was now only the whistle of wind over the canopy and the scream of every warning system in the cockpit lighting up at once. At this altitude, at this speed, a pilot has perhaps 12 seconds to live. 12 seconds between the first flicker of the engine instruments and the moment the aircraft plows into the earth at the speed of a bullet. The pilot's hand moved toward the ejection handle, that yellow and black striped loop that meant survival. It also meant failure. It meant admitting the machine had beaten him. He didn't pull it. What happened in the next 30 seconds would change Pakistan's air defense strategy for a generation. 3 engine failures, 3 pilots who nearly died, and one brutal lesson about what happens when marketing promises meet operational reality. This is the story of how Pakistani pilots, after experiencing the terrifying reality of Chinese engines quitting at the worst possible moments, demanded their American F-16s back and never looked at Chinese fighters the same way again. The Cold War turned South Asia into a chessboard, and by 1985, Pakistan was running out of moves. To understand why Pakistani military planners were even considering Chinese fighters aircraft from a nation still recovering from the Cultural Revolution's industrial devastation, you need to understand the peculiar hell of being a small nation trapped between superpowers, dependent on an ally that had already abandoned you once and would certainly do so again. The Americans had walked away before, after supporting Pakistan through the 1965 war with India conflict, in which Pakistani pilots had performed admirably, achieving remarkable kill ratios against Indian hunters, and Nats Washington imposed a devastating arms embargo following the 1971 catastrophe. The war that tore East Pakistan away to become Bangladesh. The war that left the Pakistani military humiliated, the nation amputated, and the Air Force desperately short of modern fighters precisely when India was flooding its inventory with Soviet hardware. MiG-21s, MiG-23s, soon MiG-29s. The capability gap wasn't just widening, it was becoming existential. The Pakistani Air Force had been the one bright spot in 1965. It's when pilots flying American-supplied F-86 Sabres and F-104 starfighters had more than held their own against a numerically superior enemy. But by the mid-1970s, those same aircraft had become museum pieces, obsolete death traps against the modern Soviet fighters India was acquiring. The psychological wound of 1971 had never healed the loss of half the nation, the surrender of 90,000 troops in Dhaka, the failure of American promises of support. The military needed to restore both capability and confidence, and fast. The Reagan administration had reopened the arms pipeline in the early 1980s, funneling F-16 fighting Falcons to Pakistan as part of the grand strategy to bleed the Soviets in Afghanistan. Pakistani territory was the essential conduit for weapons flowing to the Mujahideen, and Washington needed Islamabad cooperative. Suddenly, after years of embargo, America was Pakistan's friend again. But everyone in Pakistan's military establishment, from the chief of air staff down to the youngest squadron leader, understood a fundamental truth about American friendship. It came with an expiration date. When the Soviets eventually left Afghanistan, when Pakistan's strategic utility diminished, when some congressman discovered something objectionable about Islamabad's nuclear program or human rights record, the Americans would find reasons to walk away again. They always did. The relationship with Washington was like living in a beautiful house built on a fault line. Comfortable, even luxurious, but you never stopped waiting for the earthquake. Which is why when Beijing came calling with an offer, Islamabad listened. The Sino-Soviet split had redrawn the map of Asian alliances in ways that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Beijing and Washington, despite their profound ideological differences, found themselves with overlapping interests containing Soviet expansionism, countering Moscow's influence in Asia, supporting anti-Soviet forces wherever they emerged. And China, emerging from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, was hungry for hard currency, diplomatic legitimacy, and a foothold in the international arms market. Pakistan offered all three. The relationship between Islamabad and Beijing had deep roots forged in shared adversity. Both nations had fought India, both opposed Soviet influence in the region. China had supported Pakistan diplomatically during the 1965 and 1971 wars, Even when military assistance was limited by China's own capabilities at the time, the 1962 Sino-Indian War had created a natural alignment. India's enemy was Pakistan's friend and vice versa. For China, arming Pakistan served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple commerce. It created a buffer against India, which had grown close to Moscow. It countered Soviet influence in South Asia. It provided leverage in regional power calculations. And it established China as an alternative to Western suppliers for developing nations tired of political lectures about democracy and human rights. For Pakistan, the Chinese connection offered something priceless: insurance against future American abandonment, access to military technology without the political strings attached to Western suppliers. The J-7 fighter that China proposed in the mid-1980s represented decades of effort to create an indigenous aviation industry. The aircraft was essentially a Chinese-built copy of the Soviet MiG-21, one of history's most produced jet fighters, with over 11,000 examples built worldwide. The Soviets had transferred the technology during the brief honeymoon of Sino-Soviet cooperation in the late 1950s, before the relationship collapsed into bitter rivalry. Chinese engineers had spent the subsequent decades attempting to master and improve the design. Learning through painful trial and error, the thousands of details that separate competent manufacturing from excellence. The development had been neither smooth nor rapid, plagued by the Cultural Revolution's chaos, technological limitations, and the challenge of mastering complex processes without Western expertise or Soviet assistance. By 1985, they were marketing the F-7M Airguard variant, the export designation with promises of improved avionics, enhanced weapons capability, and crucially, better engine reliability. The marketing materials emphasized everything a budget-conscious Air Force wanted to hear: combat-proven heritage, low acquisition cost, simple maintenance, no political strings attached, a fraction of the F-16s price, no congressional hearings about human rights or nuclear proliferation. I want to be clear here. The J-7 was not inherently a bad design. The MiG-21 concept had proven itself in combat from Vietnam to the Middle East, to the Indo-Pakistani wars themselves. The aerodynamics were sound. The weapon system was adequate for its era. As a lightweight, high-performance interceptor, the concept had genuine validity. The problem wasn't the airframe. The problem was what made it move. To understand what Pakistani test pilots were about to experience, you need to understand the vast canyon that separated American and Chinese engine technology in 1985. This wasn't a gap that could be bridged with clever engineering or determined effort. It was the accumulated difference of decades of investment, institutional knowledge, of manufacturing precision, of painful lessons learned and incorporated into every subsequent design. The General Electric F-110 engine that powered Pakistan's F-16s represented the absolute cutting edge of American turbofan technology, the accumulated wisdom of decades of jet propulsion development, billions of dollars in research, and painful lessons learned from engine failures over Vietnam, where unreliable power plants had cost pilots their lives at critical moments. The F-110 produced nearly 29,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner raw power that allowed the F-16 to accelerate vertically, to sustain 9G turns, to climb from sea level to 40,000 feet in under 2 minutes. But the numbers told only part of the story. Every component in that engine was manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The compressor blades were forged from advanced titanium alloys that maintained their structural properties at temperatures approaching 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt most metals into slag. The fuel control system used sophisticated electronic controls that monitored hundreds of parameters, adjusting fuel flow microsecond by microsecond to prevent dangerous conditions from ever developing. American engineers had learned painful lessons about engine reliability during Vietnam. F-4 Phantom pilots had experienced engine failures at critical combat moments, lessons that had been incorporated into every aspect of the F-110's design. The testing regime alone was extraordinary: simulated bird strikes, compressor stalls, extreme temperature variations, rapid throttle movements, high-G maneuvering, foreign object damage. Engine that showed any deviation from specifications was rejected and torn down for analysis. General Electric employed thousands of engineers and technicians, many with decades of experience in turbine design. They operated testing facilities that could replicate any conceivable operational scenario. The institutional knowledge was irreplaceable, the accumulated wisdom of what works, what fails, and why. The result was an engine that pilots could trust, absolutely. When you pushed the throttle forward in an F-16, the engine responded. Every time. Whether you were at sea level or 50,000 feet, whether you were cruising at 300 knots, or pulling 9 Gs in a knife fight with an enemy fighter, the Liang WP-7 turbojet that powered the J-7 was a fundamentally different proposition. Based on the Soviet Tumansky R-11 design from the 1950s, the W-7 produced roughly 13,000 pounds of thrust, less than half the F-110's output. But the deficit in raw power was actually the least of its problems. A less powerful engine can still be a good engine if it's reliable. The WP-7 was not reliable. Chinese metallurgy in the 1980s lagged behind Western standards by perhaps 2 decades. This wasn't a matter of effort or intelligence. Chinese engineers were as capable as their Western counterparts, but of industrial infrastructure, of accumulated manufacturing knowledge, of quality control systems that took generations to develop. The titanium alloys used in critical hot section components were neither as pure nor as consistently manufactured as their American equivalents. Heat treatment processes critical for ensuring metals maintain their properties under extreme stress were less precisely controlled. The result was engine components more susceptible to heat-related failures, metal fatigue, and unpredictable degradation over time. Quality control varied wildly between factories, between production shifts, sometimes between individual workers installing critical components. One engine might perform adequately for its entire service life. The next, from the same production line, might have a compressor blade with microscopic flaws that would cause catastrophic failure at exactly the wrong moment. The fuel control systems were hydromechanical rather than electronic holder technology that made the engines more prone to compressor stalls and flameouts during rapid throttle movements or unusual flight conditions. Manufacturing tolerances were measured in hundredths of an inch rather than thousandths. Testing procedures before engines left the factory were limited fewer hours of operation, less comprehensive evaluation across the full flight envelope. None of this made the WP-7 a worthless engine. It made it a marginal one. An engine that worked most of the time, under most conditions. An engine adequate for air forces with lower operational tempos, less demanding missions, greater tolerance for accidents. But for Pakistan, facing the Indian Air Force in potential combat outnumbered, outgunned, depending on qualitative superiority to survive adequate, was a death sentence. In the arms trade, cheap is a word that gets pilots killed. When the Pakistani Air Force evaluation team arrived at the test facility, they brought some of the service's most experienced pilots. These weren't fresh academy graduates learning to fly jets. Many had combat experience from the wars with India. All had thousands of hours in high-performance aircraft. Several had already transitioned to the F-16, giving them a direct basis for comparison. The test program was meant to be comprehensive. Low-altitude performance, high-altitude intercepts, dogfighting characteristics, weapons delivery, and most importantly, reliability under the demanding conditions of military operations. 3 phases, 3 different flight regimes, 3 opportunities for the J-7 to prove itself. What happened instead would become a case study in why reliability matters more than price tags. The morning was clear. Visibility extended for miles in every direction, the kind of crystalline day that pilots call severe clear. A perfect day for a high-altitude intercept simulation. Squadron leader Matt Mootnot, his real name, as the evaluation records were never fully declassified, had logged over 2,000 hours in fighters, including combat time from border skirmishes with India. He'd flown everything in the Pakistani inventory across his career, from aging F-86 Sabres to the newest F-16 Fighting Falcons. He knew what a good aircraft felt like in his hands. More importantly, he knew what a bad one felt like. The J-7 had felt acceptable so far, responsive enough. Adequate power for the intercept profiles they'd been flying. Nothing to write home about, but nothing alarming either. The mission profile was standard. Climb to 40,000 feet, accelerate to near maximum speed, simulate an intercept of a high-flying reconnaissance aircraft. The kind of profile Pakistani pilots might need to execute against Indian Canberra bombers or high-altitude surveillance. Platforms missions that required climbing fast, flying fast, getting into weapons range before the target could escape. At 40,000 feet, the world changes. The air holds only a quarter of its sea level density. Engines work harder to produce less thrust. The sky above darkens toward the blue-black of space. The horizon curves visibly. Pilots breathe pressurized oxygen and wear pressure suits because the human body cannot survive unprotected at this altitude. The margin between controlled flight and catastrophe narrows with every 1,000 feet of altitude gained. The J-7 was performing adequately. Mahmud had the throttle forward, accelerating through Mach 0.9, then 0.92, then 0.95. The engine note was steady, the aircraft stable, the instruments green across the board. Without warning, the WP-7 began to surge. The smooth roar of the turbojet became a series of violent bangs, like a massive door slamming repeatedly as airflow through the compressor disrupted, stalled, recovered, stalled again. The aircraft shuddered with each bang, the vibrations running up through the control stick into Mahmud's hands. Before he could react, before his hands could even begin moving toward the emergency procedures, the engine flamed out entirely. First, the afterburner extinguished the characteristic roar, dying to a whisper. Then, 2 seconds later, the main combustor went dark. Silence. The silence was the worst part. For seconds before, there had been the constant reassuring roar of 13,000 pounds of thrust. There was now only the whistle of wind over the canopy and the urgent screaming of every warning system in the cockpit. At 8 miles above the earth, with nothing but thin air between him and the ground, Mahmud learned what his aircraft really thought of him. The cockpit lit up with warning lights, a Christmas tree of red and amber, engine failure. Hydraulic pressure dropping as the engine-driven pumps spooled down, electrical system degrading as the generators went offline. The J-7 was now a 16,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick, descending at approximately 10,000 feet per minute. At 40,000 feet, he had perhaps 4 minutes before impact. The altitude gave him precious time that a pilot at low altitude would never have. Time to think, time to work the problem, time to attempt restart after restart. But high altitude also presented unique challenges. At this height, the air is so thin that windmilling the engine for restart is far more difficult than at lower altitudes. The compressor blades spin uselessly in the near vacuum, unable to generate the airflow needed for ignition. Mahmud forced himself to work through the emergency checklist with disciplined precision. Fighting the instinctive surge of adrenaline, the natural human tendency toward panic when facing death. His hands moved across the cockpit controls with practiced efficiency that came from thousands of hours of training. The WP-7's restart procedure required precise throttle movements and specific airspeeds. Too fast, and excess airflow would blow out any ignition attempt like a candle in a hurricane. Too slow, and there wouldn't be enough air to support combustion. He pushed the nose down gently, trading precious altitude for airspeed, letting the dead engine windmill in the thin atmosphere while he built up velocity for the restart attempt. 35,000 feet. First restart attempt. Throttle to the specified position. Ignition button depressed. Nothing. The engine remained dead, the turbine blades windmilling uselessly, the cockpit silent except for the wind and the alarms. 30,000 feet. Second attempt. Airspeed adjusted slightly to provide better conditions, still nothing. The ground, still distant, but inexorably approaching, continued to rise toward him. 25,000 feet. Decision altitude approaching. Continue trying, or eject while there was still enough height for a safe parachute descent. Every pilot knows the old saying, better to eject too early than too late. A parachute needs altitude to deploy properly. On the third attempt, at 22,000 feet, merely 20,000 feet below where the failure had occurred, the WP-7 finally caught. The turbojet's roar returned, hesitant at first, then building as the engine spooled up to operational speed. The tachometer needle swung upward. The warning lights began to extinguish one by one. Mahmud leveled off, hands steady on the controls, but heart pounding at 160 beats per minute. He initiated an immediate return to base, keeping throttle movements gentle, the flight profile conservative, treating the engine like a wounded animal that might turn on him at any moment. Because an engine that had quit once could quit again, at any moment. without warning. The flight back must have been the longest of his life. 2 weeks later, different pilot, different mission profile, same aircraft type. Wing Commander Hassan, again, not his actual name, was one of the most experienced strike pilots in the Pakistani Air Force. He'd practiced the kind of low-level, high-speed penetration runs that would be required in a war with India, screaming across the landscape at 500 feet and 600 miles per hour. Below radar coverage, hitting targets before the enemy knew you were there. Low-level strike flying is perhaps the most demanding and dangerous mission in fighter aviation. At 500 feet and Mach 0.8, the pilot is constantly monitoring terrain, making split-second adjustments to avoid obstacles, maintaining intense situational awareness while the earth blurs past beneath him. A moment's inattention means death. The J-7 was performing well, engine responding crisply to throttle inputs. Hassan was in the zone, that state of heightened awareness where experienced pilots operate almost on instinct. Then the engine began to lose power. No surge, no warning, just power fading. At 500 feet and 600 miles per hour, a pilot has perhaps 12 seconds from the onset of a problem to impact. There's no time for analysis, no time for troubleshooting. Decisions must be instantaneous. Ejection at this speed and altitude is extraordinarily dangerous. The Martin Baker seat was theoretically capable of 0 ejections, 0 airspeed. But at 600 miles per hour and 500 feet, Hassan would be at the absolute edge of the envelope. Significant risk of the parachute not fully deploying before impact. At a significant risk of the ejection forces themselves, causing severe injury. What Hassan did next demonstrated why some pilots are merely competent and others are exceptional. In a single fluid motion, he pulled back hard on the stick-trading airspeed for altitude, while his right hand moved to attempt an emergency restart, and his left hand positioned near the ejection handle. The zoom climb bought him altitude at the cost of airspeed. The nose pitched up sharply as Hassan pulled 5-6 Gs, his vision graying at the edges as blood drained from his head. The J-7 clawed upward, even with a dead engine, trading kinetic energy for potential energy. 500 feet became 800, then 1,000, then 1,500, then 2,200, but airspeed was bleeding just as fast. 600 miles per hour became 500, then 400, then 300, then 250. As the indicated airspeed approached 200 miles per hour dangerously, close to stall speed, the aircraft began to buffet and shake. Wings approaching the critical angle of attack, where they would simply stop generating lift. Hassan was now at 2,200 feet, nose pointed nearly vertical, almost 0 forward speed. The aircraft shaking violently from pre-stall buffet. Stall warning screaming in his ears. He had perhaps 3 seconds before the J-7 would depart controlled flight and tumble out of the sky. Every instinct, every hour of training screamed at him to eject. He was out of altitude, out of airspeed, out of time. His right hand moved the throttle through the restart sequence one final time. At 185 knots, 15 knots above stall, the WP-7 roared back to life. Hassan later said it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. He pushed the nose down aggressively, trading altitude for airspeed, letting the aircraft accelerate back to a safe flying speed. He leveled off at 1,200 feet, hands trembling slightly, breathing hard, heart hammering at 170 beats per minute. The entire sequence from initial power loss to recovery had consumed 30 seconds. 30 seconds containing a compressed lifetime of fear, skill, split-second decisions, and desperate action. When maintenance crews examined his aircraft after landing, they found stress cracks in the airframe from the violent maneuvers. Testament to how close the incident had come to disaster. 2 different pilots, completely different flight profiles, 2 different altitude regimes, 2 vastly different threat windows, exactly the same catastrophic result. The pattern was becoming undeniable. The WP-7 engine had fundamental reliability problems that made it unsuitable for the demanding operations Pakistan would need to conduct against a sophisticated adversary like India. These weren't isolated incidents caused by pilot error or unusual conditions. These were symptoms of systemic issues with engine design, manufacturing quality, or both. But the evaluation program continued. Both Pakistani and Chinese officials had substantial reasons to hope these failures were anomalous. China had invested enormous resources in developing the F-7M air guard specifically for export. Losing the Pakistani contract would be a major setback for their aviation ambitions. Pakistani officials who had advocated for evaluating the J-7 faced professional embarrassment if the program failed. Institutional momentum in military organizations is powerful. Programs are rarely terminated based on 2 incidents, no matter how serious. The decision was made to continue with one final phase: air combat maneuvering against the F-16, the ultimate test. If low-level strike flying is the most dangerous mission in fighter aviation, dogfighting is the most demanding. The physical and mental requirements are almost superhuman, split-second decisions. Constant, 3-dimensional, situational awareness. Violent maneuvering that pushes both aircraft and pilot to absolute physiological limits. At 8 Gs common in modern air combat, a pilot's body weight increases 8-fold. A 170-pound man effectively weighs over 1,300 pounds. Blood drains from the brain toward the lower body as the cardiovascular system struggles against the inexorable pull of acceleration, without aggressive muscle tensing and specialized breathing techniques. Consciousness fades within seconds. First the vision narrows to a tunnel, then grays out, then blacks out entirely. Every control input requires enormous physical effort when you weigh half a ton. Turning your head to check your 6 o'clock to see if an enemy is sneaking up from behind becomes almost impossible. Pilots wear G-suits that squeeze their legs and abdomen to force blood back toward the brain. But even with this assistance, sustained high-G maneuvering is extraordinarily punishing. Flight Lieutenant Ahmed was pulling 6 Gs in a hard sustained turn. He's fighting for position against a Pakistani F-16 in simulated combat. The J-7 was at a disadvantage from the start. The American fighter had superior thrust-to-weight ratio, better sustained turn performance, more sophisticated avionics. Ahmed was flying aggressively, trying to use the J-7's lighter weight and smaller turn radius to offset the F-16's raw performance advantage. The rapid throttle movements of dogfighting, the high G-forces affecting fuel flow and air intake dynamics, the stress on engine components from constant power changes, full afterburner to military power to idle and back again within seconds. The WP-7 was operating in exactly the conditions that exposed its fundamental inadequacy. The engine quit. No warning, no preliminary indications, no surge or sputter. One moment, Ahmed had full power available to maintain his turn rate and fight for advantage. The next moment, silence. The aircraft instantly transformed from a maneuvering fighter into a glider, but a glider still pulling 6 Gs. Still in a hard turn, energy bleeding away with nothing to replace it. The nose dropped as thrust disappeared, the aircraft's turn rate decaying immediately. Ahmed faced multiple simultaneous emergencies, each potentially fatal, compounded by an ongoing tactical situation that in real combat would have added the immediate threat of being killed by the enemy. First, reduce G-loading immediately to prevent an accelerated stall. Without thrust, he couldn't maintain the turn. He relaxed back pressure on the stick, letting the nose drop, trading tactical position for basic survival. Second, maintain awareness of the F-16 somewhere in the immediate vicinity. In a real engagement, losing track of your opponent while dealing with an emergency is usually fatal. The other pilot doesn't stop fighting just because you have a problem. Third, attempt engine restart while simultaneously managing the aircraft's airspeed and altitude to keep himself in a recoverable flight condition. Fourth, continuously assess whether the situation was recoverable at all, or whether to eject before the energy state deteriorated past the point of no return. All of this decision-making had to occur in perhaps 15 seconds. While Ahmed's brain was still oxygen-deprived from sustained G-forces and his body was dealing with the aftermath of extreme physical stress, his flight suit was soaked with sweat. His muscles were trembling from the sustained effort of fighting the G-forces, and his engine was dead. "Knock it off! Knock it off!" Ahmed called over the radio, the universal signal to terminate an engagement. Actual emergency. Engine failure. The F-16 pilot immediately extended away from the stricken J-7, providing clear airspace for recovery while maintaining visual contact in case Ahmed needed to eject. At 15,000 feet, airspeed decaying through 350 knots, Ahmed successfully restarted the WP-7 after 30 seconds of frantic work. 30 seconds during which his life hung on whether a marginally manufactured Chinese engine would choose to cooperate. He recovered to level flight and declared an emergency. But by this point, everyone involved, pilots, maintenance crews, evaluators, Pakistani officials, Chinese technical representatives, knew the truth. 3 engine failures in a limited test program. Failures across completely different flight regimes. High-altitude cruise, low-level high-speed penetration, air combat maneuvering, 3 different pilots, 3 different sets of conditions. 3 times the WP-7 had simply quit without warning. The evaluation was over. The Pakistani pilots didn't write formal rejection letters, didn't need elaborate reports or detailed technical analyses. The message was simple and devastating. Give us back our F-16s. That was the demand in various diplomatic phrasings that traveled up the chain of command to the highest levels of the Pakistani military and political establishment. Not a preference for American equipment based on cultural affinity or political calculation, not bias against Chinese technology on principle, not the result of insufficient evaluation or premature judgment. Empirical evidence. 3 near-fatal engine failures. 3 of the most experienced pilots in the Pakistani Air Force pushed to the absolute limits of their skill and training to survive equipment that had tried to kill them. The contrast with the F-16 was stark and undeniable. Pakistani F-16s had been flying for years by this point, accumulating thousands of flight hours across the fleet in the most demanding operational conditions, high-altitude intercepts, low-level strikes, aggressive air combat training. Engine failures were so rare as to be nearly unheard of. The GE power plant simply worked consistently, reliably, under every condition pilots could throw at it. The J-7, whatever its theoretical capabilities, whatever its performance in other air forces with less demanding requirements, was not reliable enough for Pakistani operational needs. In potential combat against a numerically superior Indian Air Force equipped with modern Soviet fighters, Pakistani pilots needed absolute confidence in their equipment. The margin for error was razor-thin. Every fighter had to be capable of engaging multiple opponents. Every pilot had to trust that when he pushed the throttle forward, the engine would respond. An engine that might quit at a critical moment during an intercept, during a strike run, during a dogfight for survival was simply unacceptable. Regardless of price, the financial calculations paradoxically favored the expensive American fighter. While the J-7's purchase price was significantly lower, perhaps a third of the F-16s, total life cycle costs told a completely different story. Aircraft with frequent engine failures require more maintenance, more spare parts, more downtime in hangars instead of on the flight line, more replacement engines. Pilots need additional emergency training. Accident rates are higher, potentially losing expensive aircraft and, far more importantly, losing irreplaceable trained pilots whose development represents years of investment and who cannot be replaced at any price. When these factors are properly accounted for, when you calculate the true cost of unreliability, cheap becomes expensive. Cheap becomes deadly. Moreover, American military assistance included comprehensive training programs. Technical support, spare parts, logistics, and integration with broader Western military systems. Pakistani pilots who trained on F-16s in the United States received world-class instruction and exposure to American tactics, procedures, and doctrine. This knowledge transfer had strategic value extending far beyond the specific aircraft. Chinese support packages, while improving over time, could not match this comprehensive approach in the 1980s. The J-7 evaluation failure had consequences extending far beyond the immediate question of which aircraft to buy. It rippled through the complex web of Cold War alliances and regional power calculations, affecting relationships that would shape South Asian security for decades. For Pakistan, the failure reinforced dependence on American hardware at precisely the moment Washington was debating whether to continue arms sales. The Reagan administration's support was tied to the Afghan war once the Soviets withdrew. Once the Mujahideen no longer needed the weapons pipeline running through Pakistani territory, the calculus would change. Every strategic analyst in Islamabad knew this. The Americans had walked away before. They would walk away again. And they did. In 1990, following the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan and mounting concerns about Pakistan's nuclear weapons program, the United States imposed Pressler Amendment sanctions that froze military cooperation. Pakistan couldn't take delivery of F-16s. It had already paid 4 aircraft sitting in Arizona with Pakistani markings, fully equipped, waiting for pilots who would never come. The payment, some $658 million, remained in American hands for years, while the aircraft sat in desert storage. If Pakistan had successfully diversified 2 Chinese suppliers in 1985, if the J-7 evaluation had produced different results, Islamabad would have had leverage in those difficult years. Alternative sources of modern fighters, reduced dependence on American goodwill. Negotiating strength when Washington came calling with demands about nuclear programs and democratic reforms. Instead, Pakistan faced the 1990s with an aging F-16 fleet it couldn't expand, an Indian Air Force growing stronger with every passing year, and no viable alternative to American equipment. For China, the failure was a significant setback in efforts to become a major arms exporter. The international defense market operates on reputation countries. Making multi-billion-dollar decisions about fighter aircraft need absolute confidence that systems will perform as advertised. Under the most demanding conditions, word travels in defense circles. The Pakistani evaluation, though never fully disclosed in official documents, became known within the international defense community. Defense attaches talked. Military journals published carefully worded analyses. Arms dealers updated their assessments of Chinese equipment. The perception that Chinese military hardware, while inexpensive, came with reliability and quality concerns became entrenched. This perception cost China sales throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, limiting their market to customers who either couldn't afford Western equipment or couldn't obtain it for political reasons. It took decades of systematic improvement, better engines, better avionics, better manufacturing processes, better quality control before China could begin to shake that reputation. And even today, when Chinese aircraft compete successfully in international markets, the ghost of those 1980s reliability problems influences buyer calculations. The gap between Chinese and American fighters in the 1980s wasn't primarily about aerodynamic design. The MiG-21 airframe that formed the basis of the J-7 was actually quite good for its intended role. Soviet engineers in the 1950s had created a genuine masterpiece of lightweight fighter design, and Chinese engineers had competently replicated its characteristics. The gap was in the thousands of small details that collectively separate adequate from excellent. The quality of raw materials and manufacturing processes, the consistency of production across factories, shifts, and individual workers, the reliability of subsystems hydraulics, electrical fuel systems, the integration of components into a coherent whole, the depth of engineering knowledge that anticipates problems before they occur. American aerospace manufacturers in the 1980s benefited from 4 decades of continuous jet aircraft production, massive research and development investment, advanced manufacturing technology, and a culture of quality that had been forged in the crucible of World War II and refined through the Cold War. Companies like General Dynamics, General Electric, and Pratt & Whitney employed not just thousands of workers, but thousands of engineers and technicians with decades of individual experience. They used computer-aided design tools that could model stress, heat, and fluid dynamics. They operated testing facilities that could simulate conditions no pilot would ever survive. They maintained quality control systems that rejected components for deviations invisible to the naked eye. The institutional knowledge was perhaps the most valuable asset, the accumulated wisdom of what works, what fails, why certain approaches succeed and others don't, how to solve problems before they become emergencies. Chinese aviation in the 1980s was still recovering from the catastrophic disruption of the Cultural Revolution and decades of isolation from Western technology. Engineers often worked with equipment that would have been obsolete in American factories 20 years earlier. Manufacturing processes relied on manual labor and individual skill rather than automated precision. Quality control was inconsistent. Most critically, the institutional knowledge that comes from continuous production and operational experience was lacking. Chinese engineers were intelligent and dedicated, but they were essentially starting from scratch, learning lessons that American and Soviet engineers had absorbed decades before. This gap could not be closed with money alone. It could not be bridged with determination or political will. It required time, systematic effort, and the accumulation of experience that comes only from building and flying aircraft year after year, generation after generation. There's another dimension to this story that specifications sheets and cost analyses cannot capture: the psychology of combat aviation. Fighter pilots are, by necessity, confident individuals. They have to be. The profession demands a willingness to accept calculated risks that would paralyze most people strapping into a machine that travels faster than a rifle bullet, pulling G-forces that can cause blackouts and broken blood vessels, engaging enemies who are actively trying to kill you. This confidence isn't arrogance, it's a survival requirement. But there's a world of difference between the calculated risks inherent in combat aviation and the unnecessary risks created by unreliable equipment. A pilot can accept the possibility of being shot down by a superior enemy. That's the nature of warfare. What no pilot can accept is the possibility of being killed by his own aircraft. Pakistani pilots who experienced or witnessed those engine failures developed a fundamental, visceral distrust of the J-7. This wasn't an intellectual assessment that could be reasoned away with statistics about mean time, between failures or assurances about improved quality control. It was something deeper, the gut-level knowledge that the aircraft had tried to kill their colleagues and might try to kill them. This distrust would have profoundly affected combat performance in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. A pilot worried about whether his engine might quit at any moment is not fully focused on the tactical situation. He's not scanning the horizon for threats with complete attention. He's not positioning for optimal advantage with total commitment. Part of his mind, perhaps a small part, but a part nonetheless, is always monitoring engine instruments, always waiting for that terrible silence, always calculating ejection options. In air combat, where engagements are decided in seconds, and the difference between victory and death can be a moment's hesitation, this psychological degradation is potentially fatal. The pilot who commits fully to a turning fight, who pushes his aircraft to its limits without reservation, will defeat the pilot who holds something back every time. The J-7's reliability problems would have created a generation of pilots who held something back, who flew with one eye on the ejection handle, who never quite trusted their aircraft to perform when performance mattered most. This psychological factor alone, independent of any technical improvements or quality control, enhancements would have compromised the J-7's combat effectiveness for years, perhaps decades. The memories of those engine failures would have been passed down through squadron-ready rooms, from experienced pilots to new arrivals, becoming part of the institutional memory of the Pakistani Air Force. Don't trust the J-7's engine at high altitude. Watch the WP-7 during rapid throttle movements. Be ready to eject if you hear anything unusual. These whispered warnings, these cautionary tales told over drinks in the officer's mess, would have shaped pilot behavior long after the specific incidents were forgotten. Trust is fragile. It's once broken, it leaves scars that never fully heal. China learned from the experiences of the 1980s, including the painful feedback from customers, like Pakistan, who had trusted Chinese equipment and been burned. The decades that followed saw a systematic effort to close the technology gap. Chinese aerospace engineers studied Western manufacturing techniques, invested in advanced materials research, developed quality control systems that would have been unimaginable in the Cultural Revolution's aftermath. The institutional knowledge that takes generations to accumulate began to grow. Modern Chinese fighters, the J-10 Vigorous Dragon, the J-20 Mighty Dragon, and the F-16 Thunder, developed jointly with Pakistan, represent dramatic improvements in quality, capability, and reliability compared to the J-7 of the 1980s. Chinese engine technology, while still lagging behind the most advanced Western and Russian power plants, has improved substantially. The WS-10 Taihong engine that powers the J-10 and J-11 represents a different era of Chinese aerospace capability. Manufacturing and quality control have reached standards that would have seemed like science fiction to the engineers struggling with inconsistent metallurgy and variable production quality in 1985. The Chinese aviation industry today is a serious international competitor, no longer offering just cheap alternatives but increasingly capable systems that can match or exceed their Western counterparts in specific performance parameters. The J-20 is one of only 3 operational 5th-generation stealth fighters in the world. But the legacy of those 1985 engine failures persists in subtle ways. Pakistan's insistence on extensive testing, rigorous quality control, Gradual introduction of new Chinese equipment reflects institutional memory lessons learned when test pilots nearly died because of unreliable engines. The F-17 Thunder program, which has produced over 100 aircraft for the Pakistani Air Force, was designed from the outset with reliability as a primary concern. Pakistani engineers were deeply involved in the development process, not just as customers but as partners, demanding standards that Chinese industry had to rise to meet. The relationship with American suppliers, despite decades of political complications, sanctions, delivery freezes, and periods of deep diplomatic tension, continues to be valued specifically for the reliability American equipment provides. When F-16s were finally delivered after the sanctions of the 1990s were eased, Pakistani pilots greeted them like old friends returning from exile. Trust, once lost, takes generations to rebuild. And in combat aviation, trust is built one reliable flight at a time. In the mid-1980s, when Pakistani pilots were experiencing those terrifying engine failures at altitudes from 500 feet to 40,000 feet, the gap between Chinese and American aviation technology was enormous, a chasm that reflected not just different levels of investment or industrial capability, but fundamentally different stages of development. The choice between the J-7 and F-16 was not close, not marginal, not a decision that could have gone either way, depending on minor factors or diplomatic pressure. It was a stark illustration of the difference between adequate and excellent, between an aircraft that might work most of the time and an aircraft pilots could trust with their lives every time, between equipment that would probably get you home and equipment that would definitely get you home. For a nation facing existential threat from a larger, better-equipped neighbor, probably is not good enough. The three engine failures that led Pakistani pilots to demand their F-16s back were more than mechanical problems. They were more than embarrassing incidents to be smoothed over with diplomatic assurances and promises of improved quality control. They were a definitive answer to a strategic question that had implications reaching far beyond the immediate procurement decision. For Pakistan's national security, establishing that qualitative superiority required absolutely reliable equipment. For sino-Pakistani relations, demonstrating that friendship alone could not overcome fundamental gaps in industrial capability. For American influence in South Asia, enforcing Pakistani dependence on Western suppliers at a critical moment. For the broader competition between different models of military-industrial development, showing that there were no shortcuts to aerospace excellence, that the thousands of small details separating adequate from excellent could not be purchased or borrowed, only earned through decades of accumulated knowledge and relentless pursuit of quality. An airframe is just metal and composites shaped to fly through air. Aluminum and titanium and carbon fiber arranged according to aerodynamic principles that have been understood for over a century. The real heart of a fighter aircraft, the component that makes everything else possible, is its engine. A reliable, powerful engine enables everything else: the speed to intercept, the maneuverability to dogfight, the weapons carriage to destroy targets, the range to reach the fight and return home, the ability to fly at the absolute edge of the performance envelope and know, absolutely know, that the power will be there when you need it most. The engine, more than any other single component, determines whether a fighter is combat-capable or a hangar queen, whether it's a weapon or a liability, whether pilots climb into the cockpit with confidence or with prayer. For the Pakistani Air Force, the lesson of 1985 was clear and unambiguous. There is no substitute for reliable equipment when your survival as a nation might depend on the outcome of air combat. No price is too high for trust. No discount is worth dying for. In those moments when the WP-7 engines flamed out and Pakistani pilots fought desperately to restart them, falling through thin air at 40,000 feet, climbing frantically from treetop height, spinning through a dogfight with a dead engine, a much larger story was being written. A story about the gap between marketing promises and operational reality. About what truly matters when the stakes are measured in lives and national survival. About the price of trust and the cost of its absence. Trust in combat aircraft is built one reliable flight at a time. It can be destroyed in a single engine failure.